NTV Television Network presents The Other Day, Current Era, 1964. Translation and voiceover by BMI Russian. Good evening. You're watching episode 4 of our series The Other Day, 1961 to 1991. Current Era. Events, people, and occurrences which defined a lifestyle. 1964. La Scala's visit to Moscow. Pensions for collective farmers. The Taganka Theatre. The K700 tractor. Okudzhava. The Aswan Dam. The Letkayenka dance. Khrushchev's resignation. And Nylon shirts. Commenting, we have screenwriter and actress Renata Litvinova. Economic expert Yegor Gaidar, political expert Sergei Karaganov, writer Anatoly Streliny. The 1964 Winter Olympics were held at the Innsbruck Winter Resort in Austria. Their main highlight, the unprecedented achievements of Queen of Skates Lidia Skoblikova. Skoblikova received Olympic gold medals for all 4 distances: 500, 1,000, 1,500, and 3,000 meters. That same year, Skoblikova won all 4 distances during World Championship competition. She then sent a letter to Khrushchev from Innsbruck, requesting admission to the Communist Party. After the Olympic Games, during a state reception, Skoblikova, as instructed by the national team, presented an Olympic pin to Khrushchev. Other heroes of those Winter Games included the first Soviet figure skating champions, Lyudmila Belousova and Oleg Protopopov. Their victory marked the beginning of a figure skating craze in the Soviet Union. Belousova and Protopopov presented a new style. Instead of performing acrobatics, they'd become one with the music and execute perfect slides. The Soviet school quickly superseded the former favorite, i.e. the German school. Its founders, Belousova and Protopopov, would later emigrate to the West, a move for which they received the nickname skate runners. American planes stationed on the British Ascension Island deployed Belgian paratroopers in Stanleyville, which was the capital of the Simba Rebellion. The Soviet Union condemned this trilateral act of aggression. A wave of protests demanding that they take their hands off the Congo swept the nation. The formerly Belgian Congo, currently known as Zaire, was where the capitalist world would obtain most of its radium, cobalt, and uranium. In order to maintain a stable supply of these strategically vital resources, the West intervened in the conflict between 3 competing Congolese regimes. One of those gangs took 1,163 white diplomats as hostages. According to a statement made by TASS, rescuing them was merely an excuse to strangle the National Liberation Movement. Foreign students would hold meetings at the US, UK, and Belgian embassies in Moscow. Workers protested at the Boretz factory, at the Moscow Sorterovichное depot, and in the Hall of Columns at the House of the Unions. The universally approved resolution stipulates that the metropolitan community, together with the rest of the Soviet Union, demands to put an end to the bloodshed in the Congo, which poses a threat to the freedom and independence of the whole of Africa. In 1964 was the year when the statute on pensions for collective farmers was passed. Until that moment, elderly collective farmers did not receive any pension. Minimal monthly payments were set at 12 rubles upon service period completion and reaching the age of 60 for women and 65 for men. State pensions, which didn't depend on farming output, served as yet another reminder that these farms were state-owned cooperatives. Meanwhile, the government became accountable for those who could no longer continue working for them. This was the first time in Russia's 1,000-year history when elderly rural inhabitants were no longer materially dependent on the younger generation. On a spineless son or a rigid daughter-in-law. Twardovsky wrote a poem where an old lady said, "It's as if I'm renting a state country house. No hassle, not a care in the world. I barely spend any money. I'm receiving pension. Every month this pension was anticipated by her alcoholic son and grandson. And rest assured, they weren't wishing her a premature death. Gennady Shpalikov wrote a screenplay, Andrei Petrov created a song, Georgy Danelia directed a movie. And they all shared a common name, walking the streets of Moscow. Sometimes all is just right with the world. A young laborer who worked at a Siberian construction site and wrote for a big magazine became friends with a couple of Muscovites, while one girl from Moscow was prepared to follow him straight into the taiga. "Are you doing okay?" And then she says, "It's all good." Then I tell her, that's never the case. And she says, "It is sometimes." The only disappointing thing was that Robertino Loretti no longer sang, due to him having matured. Otherwise, it's nice to live in a big country, the heart of which is the capital city of our motherland. Moscow was caught in a serious summer downpour, which temporarily rendered it a universally loved town. USSR Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev meets with President Gamal Abdel Nasser. On August 1st, 1964, Soviet radio's number 2 program broadcasts the informational musical station Mayak for the first time ever. Round-the-clock transmission of Mayak was meant to lure listeners away from foreign voices. Mayak's legendary jingle would become a song called Moscow Nights by Leningrad resident Vasily Solovyov-Sedoy. 5 minutes of breaking news, followed by 24 minutes of music, then the 5 plus 24 cycle would repeat itself again. All songs approved for listening were employed, with the lineup typically being sorted by volume and genre. Mayak could be heard coming from loudspeakers at parks, at resorts. People would tune in at offices and relatively quiet workshops, in waiting rooms or in their cars. The Mayak station, which was the Soviet precursor to FM radio, was what helped people grow accustomed to background music. May of 1964 was the first time our country's leader paid a visit to Africa. Nikita Khrushchev travels to the United Arab Republic to attend the ceremony during which the Nile was blocked off by the Aswan Dam. To Egypt, the Aswan Dam was a very important structure. Its purpose was to generate electricity and control the water in the Nile River. At that point, construction had been underway for a good 4 years, funded by long-term loans from the Soviet Union. But even more substantial than economic cooperation was our military partnership. At the time, Egyptian forces were mostly armed with Soviet equipment. By providing substantial aid to Arab regimes, particularly Nasser's government, the Soviet Union was looking to fulfill multiple tasks. There was the obvious desire to outflank the adversary and establish an outpost in one of the world's key regions. It should be said that we successfully achieved much of what we were looking to accomplish. For years, we basically dominated that region, to the point where it appeared as if socialism was coming out on top. But at some point, our weak economic model prompted the Arabs to approach the Western world. They did proceed in that direction, but fell a bit short. During that ceremony in Aswan, Khrushchev awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union to United Arab Republic President Gamal Abdel Nasser and Vice President Abdel Hakim Amer. This happened after social reforms were implemented in Egypt during the early 60s, which could be labeled as socialistic if one so desired. Apparently, Nasser tried to avoid receiving his title, suggesting that they also honor his vice president, in hope that the Soviet Union wouldn't award the title to 2 Egyptians at once. However, this didn't faze Khrushchev. It seemed as if nobody in the USSR approved of Nasser receiving the title Hero of the Soviet Union. Many considered it outright insulting. Well-read citizens had their suspicions about our Arab allies, expecting those cunning Easterners to betray us at any moment. The president of the UAR went by the last name of Nasser. That's the name Russian people later ascribed to Yemen's leader Ali Nasser Mohammed. His Egyptian counterpart's name, however, was slightly modified, resulting in what can roughly be translated from Russian as Gamal Abdel shits on everyone. Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev bestows a Gold Star Medal upon Tatar Zhivkov. In 1964, a collection of poems called Anti-Worlds was released, written by the Soviet Union's last futurist, Andrei Voznesenskyi. Voznesenskyi, who graduated from the Institute of Architecture, preferred to see things for what they really are. He glorified striptease, plum pits, charcoal and cinders, and the transparent temples which were airports. His anti-worlds described X-rays, Rublev, and women as wonders of the world. Voznesenskyi would use twice as many words as his contemporaries, with people calling his work incomprehensible. Praise for a futurist doesn't get any higher than that. Nature's plan doesn't involve a final destination. We will live forever, and that's a certainty. In the summer of 1964, Anastas Mikoyan, the absolute champion when it comes to political longevity, is appointed as chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, becoming the formal head of state in the process. This was the peak of Anastas Mikoyan's career, him having spent 40 years in the Politburo and 50 in the Central Committee. Even more important than that, the former chairman of the Supreme Soviet, Leonid Brezhnev, becomes the unofficial second secretary of the Communist Party Central Committee. In 1964, after watching the movie Who Are You, Mr. Sorge by French director Yves Ciampi, Khrushchev said something along the lines of, "If only intelligence officers like that really existed." He was informed that the movie wasn't fiction. Khrushchev ordered to declassify Sorge and posthumously honor him as a hero of the Soviet Union. That's how people found out that the Soviet Union also had intelligence operatives. The only other spy prior to Richard Sorge whose existence was recognized amidst the enemy was Nikolai Kuznetsov, a member of Medvedev's partisan unit, who had no connection to the NKVD or the military. Sorge marked the beginning of an espionage craze in Russia, a wise center, a valiant and intelligent resident who anticipated the Germans' every move, and a radio operator, delicate but prepared to be heroic. Songs from the Taiga cycle by composer Alexandra Pakhmutova, based on poetry by Grebennikov and Dobronravov, resonated all throughout the country. Girls dancing on deck towards the morning sunrise on the Angara, a song called Powerline 500, not just any line, Marchuk is playing his guitar while the sea sings, and most importantly, what matters most, guys?
Песни, что придумали, до конца допеть. В дальний путь собрались мы, а в этот край таежный только с самолета можно долететь. А ты, улетающий вдаль самолет, в сердце своем сбереги. Под крылом самолета о чем-то поет зеленое море тайги. Под крылом самолета о чем-то поет зеленое море тайги.
Pakhmutova's music is well known and much appreciated. On April 23, 1964, the Taganka Drama and Comedy Theatre first opened its doors. This was the place where honored artist of the RSFSR Yuri Lyubimov spent his senior year at the Boris Shukin Theatre Institute, with his diploma project in the form of a play called A Good Man from Szechuan. Lyubimov suggested that theater of experience was making way for theater of presentation, which is why his theater started not at the coat hanger, but even earlier, in the yard before the theater. The square before the theater was completely packed right from the very first play. Even the director himself enjoyed walking out onto the square. Before the beginning of the play, 10 Days That Shook the World, they'd switch on songs from revolutionary times for everybody around to listen to, and tickets were stuck onto bayonets by soldiers and sailors who were standing at the entrance instead of the usual old ladies. You can't help but appreciate the older, forgotten play formats. Kalish, borderline kapustnik viewing. The theater's leading actors included Alla Demidova, Veniamin Smechov, Zinaida Slavina, who was in Lyubimov's group at the Shukin Institute, Vladimir Vysotsky, who transferred to Taganka from the Pushkin Theater, Valery Zlatuhin, who used to perform at the Mossovет Theater, Each one of the theater's productions echoed relevant events, and every one of them caused a scandal. Scandals became a trademark of the Taganka Theatre, just like the red box in its logo, plays such as Hamlet starring Vysotsky, and The Master and Margarita. Likely due to the infatuation with the taiga, people started treating wild beasts as if they were domesticated animals. Either hunters would stumble upon a bear den in the forest and bring home a couple of cubs. Jack the puppy has some new friends now, Mishka and Mashka. Or a meteorologist would tame a deer and a lynx in the taiga. Their lingering animosity is finally put to rest. People in big cities didn't have as many opportunities. This was filmed in Kiev. The cat considers these orphan squirrels to be its own, while the kittens are now their foster brothers. Among those nominated for a Lenin Prize in 1964 was the most prominent journalist writing about wild animals, Vasily Peskov, who contributed to the Komsomolskaya Pravda. On April 17th, Comrade Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev, who was a prominent figure in the international communist movement, turned 70. But the main event associated with Khrushchev in 1964 was not his anniversary. Precisely 6 months after he gave a speech at his birthday reception, when he said that 70 is still a young age, on October 17th a short message was published in the papers. The Central Committee accepts NS Khrushchev's decision to resign as first secretary of the Communist Party Central Committee, member of the Central Committee Presidium, and chairman of the Council of Ministers of the USSR, due to his old age and deteriorating state of health. This was the first time in Soviet history when the national leader's departure wasn't due to him passing away. Officially, Khrushchev was relieved on his own request, when in fact he was forced to step down. The very same people who congratulated and honored Khrushchev in the spring spent the entire summer carefully negotiating with other Central Committee members in order to ensure a unanimous vote when it came time to sort out the key organizational matter. People were fed up with Khrush, as they called the head of the party at these meetings. Him and his constant innovations and shaking up the government apparatus. While Khrushchev was on vacation, a broad meeting of the Central Committee Presidium was called, where Secretaries Suslov and Shelepin insisted that it was time to relieve the head of state from his post. On the very next day, Khrushchev was summoned from his vacation to a plenary meeting with a predetermined outcome. Suslov presents his report about Khrushchev going too far on occasions and generally being unrestrained. On October 15, 1964, Khrushchev officially becomes a special pensioner of the Soviet government. Khrushchev's run as head of state coincided with a turning point in our history, in terms of the Soviet Union's economic development. In the beginning, we still had a blossoming industrial sector, rapid economic growth. The new government was enjoying victory after victory. Then we came face to face with increasing difficulties, a farming crisis which forced us to purchase foreign grain, and a decline of the consumer market. Khrushchev wasn't willing to accept a decrease in economic growth. He couldn't accept that in many ways socialism had run its course as an economic model. He established an economic council, divided party organizations into urban and rural factions. He fought against grassland farming, he planted corn, restricted the size of household gardens, but to no avail. The country simply couldn't fulfill the latest goals for economic growth without making some serious changes. After Khrushchev stepped down, Republican regional and provincial meetings of party leaders were held, where the meaning of the term volunteerism was explained. This would soon become the only word people would use to describe the decade when Khrushchev was in power, while Khrushchev's last name was effectively banned. Khrushchev became a part of national folklore, as a character in various comical tales. The most well-known legend had to do with a fine that the USSR allegedly had to pay for Khrushchev's banging his shoe on the podium at the UN General Assembly. As a matter of fact, he was hitting his desk in the auditorium, which nobody seemed to mind. Though he was later reprimanded when he spoke from the podium, any sort of fine was completely out of the question. So who is Franco? Franco butchered the people of Spain. He crushed the parliament, while abolishing the legitimate government, which was appointed by the Spanish parliament. Here, the chairman interrupts the head of the Soviet government and announces that his words will not be included in the official record of the meeting. I consider your remarks completely inappropriate. If that's the case, why didn't you interrupt the United States representative when he slandered the regime of the great nation of China? I see double standards. I reject your statement. People would joke about Khrushchev without any sort of animosity, and not because the government forgot its promises about pensions and releasing prisoners from camps. Jokes about Khrushchev were nothing like the jokes made about Stalin. Khrushchev's exuberant character, amusing appearance, cheerful manner of speech, all of this suggested a simple and fun interpretation of the doings of this hectic reformer. At the time, millions of people expected Khrushchev to be remembered by history as the corn man, first and foremost. This amazing crop, which didn't do anything wrong, became an object of ridicule, a situation which was partially sanctioned by the powers that be. Even just the word corn brought a smile to people's faces. So the Americans made it to Mars, where they were met by Martians who told them, "You're too late. We were already paid visit by this bald guy who dug everything up to plant some corn." Khrushchev's successor as head of the Communist Party Central Committee was Leonid Brezhnev. Before that, he was secretary of regional committees in Ukraine, as well as secretary of the central committees in Moldavia and Kazakhstan. For 4 years, Brezhnev was the head of the Supreme Soviet, and for the last 3 months leading up, he was second secretary of the Communist Party Central Committee. Meanwhile, Alexei Kosygin was appointed as prime minister, him being a professional economic planner. Prior to that, for 24 years, he served as deputy and first deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers. Among other replacements in the wake of Khrushchev's resignation was the retirement of the country's most renowned newspaper executive, Alexei Adjubey, who was a close companion of Khrushchev and even married his daughter Rada, who was also a journalist by trade. There was a saying about Khrushchev's son-in-law, instead of having 100 rubles, you'd be better off to marry like Adjubey. At the start of his career, Alexei Adjubey was doing a great job with Komsomolskaya Pravda. The amount of copies printed of Izvestia went up 20-fold thanks to him, from 400,000 to 8 million. The first ever Sunday attachment in the country's history was released, called Nedelya, or Week newspaper. After his retirement, Adjubey found a job at Soviet Union newspaper, where he took up a pen name. In the fall of '64, the Bolshoi Theatre's opera troupe and the Milan-based La Scala went on foreign exchange tours. This was the first time they came to Moscow so fully stacked, with 400 people, including conductor Herbert von Karajan, a classic neorealist, director Luchino Visconti together with his apprentice and assistant Franco Zeffirelli, stage designer Nicola Benoit, and Bulgarian bass singer Nikolai Giaurov. The international team performed at the Bolshoi Theatre and the Palace of Congresses. Throughout the course of 3 weeks, 70,000 people attended their plays. They had to arrange 5 additional concerts, 4 of which were broadcast on TV. They also aired The Barber of Seville, while the radio played Turandot and Il Trovatore. Through La Bohème, La Scala presented Bel Canto not as the pinnacle, but as the basic condition for opera's very existence. Later, Zeffirelli would convert this play into his famous movie. Karajan would conduct the Verdi Requiem in his own dry manner. At times, he would freeze before the orchestra, close his eyes, and cross his arms. '64 was the year when the nation witnessed the creation of 2 legendary farming machines. The Leningrad-built K700 Kirovets tractor, manufactured at the former Putilovets factory, and the track-type DT-75 from Volgograd. The Kirovets became the nation's flagship tractor. It was fitted with a 200-horsepower diesel engine, wheels 1.5 times taller than a human being, and it was compatible with pretty much all types of additional equipment. Back then, nobody seemed concerned with how harmful such a huge and heavy machine would be to the soil. Meanwhile, the DT-75s were able to make it to every collective farm based on their superior off-road capabilities. During the spring mud season, they were pulling out every vehicle that got stuck, including tractors from other manufacturers. In honor of Shakespeare's 400th anniversary, Grigory Kazantsev adapted his old theatrical production of Hamlet for the big screen. Playing the role of the Danish prince made Innokenty Smoktunovsky the most prominent intellectual in Soviet film. Poor Yorick. I knew him, Horatio. A fellow of infinite jest, of most excellent fancy. He hath borne me on his back 1,000 times. And now how abhorred in my imagination it is. The word intellectual invoked the term crazy to a certain degree. Innokenty Smoktunovsky, with his pained gaze and aristocratic last name, would play unstable smart guys. He was an ideal as opposed to a real intellectual. Plenty of actors would learn how to somewhat decently portray the thought process, but only Smoktunovsky would be able to convey that aura of universal respect that used to be reserved for university professors in the olden days. The king's to blame! The rapier is also poisoned. So go, poisoned steel, to your calling! The decree to crack down on those people evading community service was passed in order to punish those who didn't have a proper job, made a living off of illegal entrepreneurial activity, engaged in speculation, or used their personal cars and summer residences for their own personal gain. Citizens' Watch and People's Courts played a critical role in combating parasitism. The decree demanded to treat these persons with zero tolerance. He hasn't been employed for several months. He's a hooligan and a drunk. It wasn't his voluntary choice to attend today's public meeting in Moscow's Sverdlovsky district. Today his behavior is subject to discussion by Soviet citizens. As for how they punished slackers in the capital cities and metropolitan areas, eviction and relocation to specially designated areas for a period of 2 to 5 years, with confiscation of all property attained by means of non-labor, and with mandatory labor at the place of settlement. Foreign rag peddlers, sellers of rock and roll records, we the people denounce them all the same. A typical example of a lawsuit against a slacker was the case filed in 1964 against a young poet and translator from Leningrad named Joseph Brodsky. He was warned that he should find himself a full-time job, but in the end he failed to register anywhere. Meanwhile, the Writers' Union's Leningrad division delivered a note to the court saying that Brodsky wasn't a poet. He was punished and sent off to a distant place, where he had to engage in mandatory labor. While the hunters were loading their rifles, Soviet heavyweight lifters Yuri Vlasov and Leonid Zhabotinsky spent the entire year of 1964 battling it out to see which one of them is the strongest man on the planet. They both one-upped each other several times, while setting new world records in the process. Their battle reached its culmination when Vlasov and Zhabotinsky squared off at the Summer Olympics in Tokyo. Early that year, Zhabotinsky, who pushed 371.5, broke Vlasov's previous record by 2 pounds. Later, Vlasov lifted a total of 1,240 pounds in 3 rounds, reclaiming the title of strongest man. Their battle peaked at the Olympic Games in Tokyo. Vlasov was considered the front-runner. He was holding the Soviet flag during the opening ceremony. After 2 rounds, Vlasov was ahead by 11 pounds. According to him, right before the 3rd round, Zhabotinsky approached him backstage. He said to him then, "You're first, I'm second. We beat the Americans. Let's just leave it at that." After that conversation, Vlasov was unable to muster a record load, allowing Zhabotinsky to become champion. Vlasov later claimed that Zhabotinsky tricked him. Fake fur became popular as a result of synthetic materials coming into fashion. Even people wealthy enough to buy clothing made from real fur would often opt for fake mink coats, as far as women go, or fake caracal fur hats, if we're talking about men. We reached a point when people grew bored of natural fur, considering it undemocratic and outdated. For many people, it was simply way beyond reach. It was very expensive. Everybody was hoping for the best, as they always do, expecting something new to come out. And when these fake coats came out, made from fake fur, people immediately took a liking to them. Then again, they grew tired of them just as quickly. It used to be that fashion would shift every 10 years, then every 5 years. In today's modern world, trends last no more than one season. People have to decide for themselves what's fashionable and what's not. In 1964, Soviet physicists Nikolai Basov and Alexander Prokhorov share the Nobel Prize with American scientist Charles Townes from the University of Columbia. The prize was awarded for fundamental work in the field of quantum electronics, specifically for inventing a quantum generator called a maser. A few years after they first started distributing tapes, given the rarity of tape players back then, and 1 year after the record came out in Britain, in 1964 a company called Melodia released a small disc titled Songs by Bulat Okudzhava. The record consisted of just 4 songs: the Arbat song, King, Along the Smolensk Road, and the Midnight Trolleybus. They were performed not by the author, and instead of a guitar accompaniment, they used an instrumental ensemble. Fans rejected the record, and Okudzhava's music never became mainstream.
Когда мне не в мочь пересилить беду, когда подступает отчаяние, я в синий троллейбус сажусь на ходу, в последний, случайный.
Я в синий троллейбус сажусь на ходу, последний, случайный.
By that time, the majority of city dwellers were very much aware of folk song heroes Ivan Morozov and Leonid Korolev. Critics considered these songs to be vulgar, while Okudzhava himself was dubbed as Vertinsky for failing college students. The stereotypical image of a bard was born: a song, its creator/performer, and his cowboy shirt or leather jacket. In Okudzhava's case, handed down from playwright Mikhail Roshin. In 1964, a TV show called Good Night Little Ones was first aired, consisting of an entertainment educational 5-minute segment and a 10-minute cartoon. The first character conceived for that opening segment was the sensitive dog Filya. Later he was joined by the romantic bunny Stepashka and the charming but slightly mischievous piglet Hrusha. Each time the puppets would get into arguments, which central television anchors would take turns resolving. When filming Good Night, they'd become uncles and aunties, the most famous of which being Auntie Valya Leontieva and Uncle Volodya Ukhin. The closing cartoon would typically be presented as a reward for working everything out. Your bumps and bruises are going to heal. The bike we're going to fix together. Yay! But now I suggest we watch a cartoon. In an unprecedented turn of events, the Order of Lenin Medal was awarded to the president of a capitalist nation. Furthermore, it wasn't even the Kremlin where he was granted the Soviet Union's highest honor. Mikoyan actually flew to the recipient, who was none other than the president of the Republic of Finland, Urho Kaleva Kekkonen. As a result of the October Revolution, Finland gained independence from Russia, and Lenin was revered in Suomi as the man who freed them. Kekkonen had been president for 25 years, sticking to the political line set by his predecessor Paasikivi, who signed a friendship treaty with the USSR after the war ended. Paasikivi and Kekkonen's course was dubbed Finlandization by the West, which implied shameful conformity in relation to the Soviet totalitarian monster. In his defense of Finland's neutrality, Kekkonen would say, "We reap more benefit from acting as a bridge than as a stronghold." Back then, Finlandization was a derogatory term used by the West. The Western Knights of the Cold War weren't fond of Finland's compliance in relation to the Soviet Union. Looking back today, it's obvious that such an approach was not just pragmatic, but rather wise. Finland received aid from the West, while successfully upholding its independence and freedom. Plus, they had access to a vast market. We all wanted their goods. The Finns themselves were prospering. This is something our Baltic neighbors should seriously take into consideration. Finland was the only country that gained something from the Cold War.
Раз, два, туфли надень-ка, а в тебе не стыдно спать. Славная, милая, смешная Енька нас приглашает танцевать. Раз, два, туфли надень-ка, а в тебе не стыдно спать. Славная, милая, смешная Енька нас приглашает танцевать.
Borrowed from Finland, the country least aggressive towards us, the Letkayenka dance was the first trendy Western melody which wasn't restricted in its popularization, and even encouraged. They even printed instructions for those who were hopping first on one foot, then the other. In 1964, nylon shirts became quite popular in the USSR. Unlike the outdated cotton, the durable and trendy nylon seemed to be the ultimate material. White nylon shirts were considered the classiest of all. They would turn yellow over time, but dry cleaners quickly learned that you can color them black. They didn't look as elegant, but in that form they could basically last forever. And that's it for 1964. Next time we're gonna cover 1965. The movie Operation Y, the obsession with motorcycles, Leonov's spacewalk, Soviet aid for Vietnam, the first computer, and rhythmic gymnastics. See you for a new episode and a new year. Farewell!